When I think of Nintendo, there are three franchises that come to mind. Obviously, Mario is the first, followed closely by Zelda, but then we have Metroid, a series which has seen fairly consistent critical acclaim, but not too much commercial success. I mean, the highest selling game in the franchise is Metroid Dread, my beloved, at just over 3 million units. While that's nothing to scoff at, it pales in comparison to the likes of Mario and Zelda, who've sold 60 and 33 million units at their peaks. However, Metroid scratches an itch for me that those other two can't. The isolated, silent, and dreadful atmosphere of these games is simply unmatched in my eyes. Whether it's the depths of Zebes, a vacant biologic space lab, or the Chozo ruins of Talon 4, Metroid has always excelled in setting a gripping tone. More than that, though, the game's loop of searching for keys to progress is an addicting one. So addicting, in fact, that Metroid and Castlevania have combined to spawn the Metroidvania genre of games, which has seen widespread success over the years with games like Hollow Knight, Axiom Verge, and most recently, Animal Well, all receiving critical success. There's a reason people are losing their collective minds over on r/Silksong, and I'm unfortunately among them. However, I am not a longtime fan of Metroid. In fact, the first game I completed in the series was Dread, and that was a year after it came out. But, if this video is any indication, I fell head over heels for that game and subsequently every one I've played since. With the recent announcement/reveal of Prime 4, I've been inspired to take a look back at the main franchise and talk about them here on the channel. That means, for better or worse, starting with the original on NES. Now, I want to state right up front that this game is not as bad as its reputation would have you believe. Is it dated? Yes. Is it frustrating? Oh god, yeah. Is it so bad that it's better to skip it? I would say no, with some caveats. The first of which is that I'd recommend you play through Zero Mission before trying the original. It's a remake, so it follows closely to the original while making a few additions and quality of life improvements. Plus, it's made on the same engine as Metroid Fusion, so it is buttery smooth. Having played both of them, I can say that Zero Mission will help you a bit in the original. Layouts are close enough that you'll have a vague idea of where to go, and you can pretty much follow the same item progression path that Zero Mission forces you down. It's on NSO now, so I'd highly recommend trying it out first, especially if it's your first Metroid game. The second caveat is to use save states and rewinding if you're playing on an emulator, which I suspect most of you watching this video will be. The original game lacked saving unless you were on the Famicom, and death can be very punishing as you'll only respawn with 30 health no matter how many energy tanks you have. So, save before a boss or rewind if a particular part is giving you trouble. There's no shame in it. Metroid can be a very esoteric game, so doing anything to reduce frustrations is absolutely okay in my book. My third caveat is to find a map online and have it open on a second monitor or something. Alternatively, if you want a more authentic experience, you could draw up your own map like the manual suggests. I've tried this, and while it can be fun, I'm quite trash at map making, so it ended up being more frustrating than anything. If it's your first time through and you don't want to bother with the old pencil and paper, then just look up a map. You're already playing with save states and rewinding, so you might as well go all the way. Some of you out there will be upset with me for suggesting save states in a map, but I will counter by saying this. The things I suggest are completely optional. Take my advice or don't, it really doesn't matter to me. I'm only saying these things because there are people out there who want to complete this game for the sake of doing so, and using this stuff just greases the gears to make that a bit easier. If you want to be a purist and experience the game as it was originally released, then by all means you can do that. But don't tear down other people for wanting to appreciate this historic game in a more palatable way. Before we get into the thick of this review, I do want to make a special shout out to a creator named HPR Shredder and his video on this game. All of his videos are extremely well made and entertaining, but his Metroid one in particular really changed my mind on the game. It inspired me to give it a go and helped me see that it's really not that bad once you get the hang of it. His video will be linked in the description below if you want to watch it after mine. I highly recommend it. But with all of that out of the way, let's jump into Metroid for the Nintendo Entertainment System and see where this beautiful franchise began. In the cosmic year of 2000, a group known as the Space Pirates attack a Galactic Federation research station to steal anything and everything they could. One item they took was a small capsule that the scientists there were researching. It turns out that this capsule is actually a Metroid, a powerful alien warrior created by the Chozo. The pirates then take the Metroid to their base on Zebes, where they intend to clone it and create an army of them. After a lengthy search, the Galactic Federation find the pirates and attempt to take back the Metroid, but are halted in their attack. In a last-ditch effort, they hire Samus Aran, a well-known and respected bounty hunter who has completed many missions deemed impossible to destroy the pirates' base and stop them from cloning the Metroids. By the way, I'm going to pronounce Aaron and Aran like so many different times in this video, and I apologize ahead of time. That is all we get for backstory leading into the game. It's not a lot, but it does set the stage well enough for us to understand who Samus is and why she's here. Obviously, there are the events of the game, such as Samus killing the leaders of the pirates, but that's it. Being a game from the 80s means there isn't much story in the game itself, aside from the one you create as you venture through the caverns of Zebes. Still, it's important to establish the wider universe. I mean, they're not called the Galactic Federation in this game, but that's basically who Samus is working for. It's neat that they're introduced this early in the franchise, despite not playing a major role until Fusion, or I guess technically Super Metroid, but they were mostly dead by the time that game started, so RIP. Much more neat, though, is the fact that Samus is actually referred to with he/him pronouns in the manual. Back then, it would generally be assumed that Samus was a man, with the likes of Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger dominating the box office with their action flicks. Beefy men saving the day was just how it was. So, to have Samus revealed as a woman by the end was a bit of a shocker. Of course, nowadays it's widely known, but I can't imagine how much of a surprise it was back in the day. Speaking of Samus, I gotta say that her sprite in this game is great. It's not anything to drive home about like Super, Fusion, or Zero Mission, but this 8-bit rendition of Samus is still iconic in its own right. The head shape is a bit wonky and the run cycle's a bit goofy, but the coloring is sick and the way she holds her arm cannon out conveys her confidence nicely. It's a look that would be built upon and improved, but one that is still iconic to the NES era. Also, I love how the Varia suit turns her pink. It's a unique thing in this game before it was changed in Super to be the iconic orange. Aside from Samus, all the sprites in the game are really well made. Admittedly, I can't name all of them, but I can describe them to you based on what they look like. The spiky boys crawl around everywhere and are a nuisance until you get the morph ball bombs. The winged pointy boys hang from the ceiling like bats until you walk under them and they dive bomb you. In Norfair, there are these little balls of flame that I think are super cute. There are also these lava-dwelling seahorses that are a bitch to take out since you can't aim downward, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Each enemy has a unique silhouette that makes them easy to identify, and there are very few enemies that live in different sections. Rippers, see, I know these guys, are the only ones that come to mind as being everywhere. However, the true highlight of enemies in this game are the titular Metroids. They just look so mean and angry. I think it's the way their brains are angled downward to look like angry eyebrows. They've also got their talons, which is a bit of a departure from how they look in the manual, but I'm not complaining. I love these little angry boys. How they're portrayed here is honestly one of my favorite looks for them. In fact, you can even see the sprite, this original sprite, in the opening cinematic for Metroid Dread, which I think is a really cool Easter egg. Surprisingly, the only sprites I'm not totally in love with are the bosses. That's not to say I think they're bad, they just don't stand out as much as the basic enemies in my mind. I love Kraid's plump little body and Ridley's spindly neck, Mother Brain's angry death stare. but they just don't stand out much to me still. Maybe it's because you only encounter them once, except for Kraid, and their fights are so easy, except for Mother Brain, that they're just forgettable. Thankfully, future renditions of these characters will come along and make them more memorable, but that's for another video. For now, I'll finish talking about aesthetics with the levels themselves. Each area in Metroid is beautiful, full stop. It never ceases to amaze me just how fantastic all of these levels can look on an 8-bit console like the NES and Famicom. Areas like Brinstar give off that shallow, subterranean feel and almost look like something you might see on Earth, were it not for the crawling spiky boys. Norfair, on the other hand, gives off a more alien vibe with its purples and reds and bubbly look. Turian and Kraid's Lair are gray and metallic, making them feel like impenetrable fortresses built solely for function over form. And behind all of it is a black background that is part technical restraint, part artistic choice. They could have put something back there, I'm sure, but the choice to stick with a plain black helps all the colors pop a bit more and keeps the oppressive atmosphere strong. After all, you're underground for the entirety of this game. It should feel that way. Alongside the visuals, you also get different themes for each area. Now, I'm not a music nerd, so I can't really say much other than it sound good, but I still gotta say, I adore Brinstar, Kraid's Lair, and the main theme so much. The first is hopeful and adventurous, getting you hyped up to begin your journey as you make your way through Brinstar. The second is foreboding and ominous, letting you know you've entered into the belly of the beast as you descend into Kraid's Lair. The third is the first one you'll hear when you boot up the game, and is an awesome combination of those two ideas. It starts out dark and foreboding before transitioning into a more hopeful section. Of course, the Metroid theme is symbolic to the franchise, especially so in Super Metroid and Dread, but it got its start here in a fantastic way. Moving away from aesthetics, I want to get into the gameplay of Metroid. It's arguably the most infamous part of the game, for better or worse. For the better, this game establishes the core loop of the Metroidvania by quickly letting you know that you'll need to get specific power-ups to make progress. The best example of this is right at the beginning. If you go right from the spawn, you'll only be able to go so far before needing something to help you get through a narrow gap blocking your path. So, you head back to the left, past the spawn, find the morph ball, and go back to the narrow gap where you can now roll on through. This is an excellent way to tell the player what they'll need to do to get through the game, but it's not a foolproof one. Eventually, the map will grow so large and you'll have so many areas to check that you'll have no clue where to go, even when you do get a new ability. Now, I am willing to give the game some leeway here since it's the first attempt, but that doesn't make it much easier to swallow. It is simultaneously a great and awful way to do things. Once you have it down and know what's going on, it's great. But until you have that knowledge, it's a slog. If the game had its own map built into it, this slog could be greatly reduced, but as it stands, there isn't one. Hence why I suggested you find one online. Despite any frustrations, though, this gameplay loop is a satisfying one. And that is absolutely true for this first game. Each upgrade feels tangible and really helps with gameplay if you know how to use them. For example, one of the biggest issues many people have with this game is the inability to aim at your feet. You can't crouch or even jump and aim downward as you fall. It's super frustrating. However, once you get the morph ball bombs, you can easily drop them and roll away as an enemy crawls over them. Is it perfect? No. Would I much rather be able to simply aim at my feet? Yes. but it's better than nothing. Unfortunately, the bombs are the only power-up with this sort of double use. However, all the other power-ups provide their own benefits. The Varia suit is a godsend simply because it reduces all damage taken by 25%. The Ice Beam is perfect for freezing enemies and setting them up for a missile finisher, and is required to kill the Metroids. The High Jump boots make traversal a breeze, and the Screw Attack lets you destroy the enemies you somersault into, which is just plain fun. When you're fully powered up, it is beyond satisfying to decimate enemies that, at one point, would send you packing over and over again. However, it cannot be denied that getting to that point is a slog, and most players aren't gonna want to put the time in to learn this stuff. More often than not, they'll resort to farming enemies for health and ammo, which is hardly a fun time. That being said, I don't think anyone is to blame here. It's not the game's fault, and it's not the player's fault. I'd say like 90% of people trying Metroid today weren't even alive when it was first released, myself included. 99 gang, rise up. I grew up in the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii era. By then, most games were able to have clear in-game tutorials that were quickly making manuals obsolete, whereas Metroid was released in an era where reading the manual wasn't only expected, but was almost required to fully understand a game. So it's no wonder why NES-era games have hardly aged well. Half of the experience is missing. Like I said from the jump though, use your save states and pull up a map if you need it. There's no shame in it. But it is still bullshit that you can't aim at your feet. I mean, for God's sake, Metroid 2 on the Game Boy allows you to crouch and aim downward when falling. It doesn't help that more often than not, the game will throw so many enemies at you that it starts to lag. They'll spawn above, below, behind, and in front of you in many areas. Oh, and when you get hit, you jump backwards, so I hope you weren't planning on doing any precision platforming, buddy. You better not die either, otherwise you'll have to start from 30 health and grind your way back up to maximum. It's really not as bad as that last paragraph would have you believe, but my god, it is still a struggle. It's no wonder why so many players bounce off this game or resort to cheats like Narpa Sordo and Justin Bailey just to experience it. I've taken the time to learn it, to meet the game where it's at, and I've had fun with it. But these frustrations aren't unfounded, and I would never fault someone for skipping this game entirely or just playing Zero Mission. Thankfully, the act of moving and shooting feels very good in this game. There's an energetic feedback in the pews of Samus's beam cannon and the way her arm jolts back when it's fired. Hitting an enemy with a missile just feels good, and somersaulting your way between platforms and enemies alike is smooth no matter what power-ups you have. Which is where Metroid draws most of its strength from, the gameplay feel. As the famous Jamie Griesemer once said, quote, "In Halo 1, there was maybe 30 seconds of fun that happened over and over and over again. So if you can get 30 seconds of fun, you can pretty much stretch that out to be an entire game. Encountering a bunch of guys, melee attacking one of them before they were aware, throwing a grenade into a group of other guys, and then cleaning up the stragglers before they could surround you. And so you have all the great graphics, and all the different characters, and lots of different weapons with amazing effects, but if you don't nail that 30 seconds, you're not gonna have a great game." Unquote. While Metroid is not as complex as Halo 1, I do think the point Jamie makes here still stands. The simple acts of shooting, running, and jumping in Metroid makes the moment-to-moment to gameplay fun, even if the enemies can be frustrating to deal with. Nintendo nailed that 30 seconds of fun, it was just everything around it that was not so good. Speaking of not so good, let's talk bosses. Not Kraid and Ridley, those guys are fine. Just spam morph balls at Kraid and spam missiles at Ridley's feet till they're both dead. They're hardly a challenge if you know what you're doing, but the rest of the game makes up for that challenge in spades, so I let it slide. However, Mother Brain and Turian are entirely different beasts. Starting with Turian, the only enemies you encounter here are the Metroids. To beat them, all you gotta do is freeze them and hit them with 5 missiles. For your trouble, they'll drop either a 30-point energy ball or a pack of 30 missiles. That's pretty awesome, all things considered. You better pray they don't latch onto you though, because once they're on, they will suck the life out of you and are a bitch to get off. Yeah, all you gotta do is morph ball and bomb, but even then, they can easily pop right back onto you after being blown off. And God help you if there's more than one in the room. Getting dogpiled by Metroids is basically certain death, even if you know how to get them off. So my strategy is just to inch forward, bit by bit, until they spawn, and then do everything in my power to freeze and demolish them. It's not a particularly fun way to play, but it does work. Once you get to Mother Brain's chamber though, all bets are off. I hope you stocked up on energy and missiles, because you're gonna need them. The gameplay speaks for itself, really. This room has so many projectiles for you to handle, and requires you to fire at these energy wall things to even reach Mother Brain. You are constantly knocked off the platforms and kept down by these goddamn Cheerios or the turrets overhead. Oh, and if you don't destroy the energy wall, it will regenerate after a bit. So, you better make those shots count, kiddo, or your ass is back to farming Metroids in Torian. At least there's a pretty easy way to farm them right outside, and the energy walls don't respawn once you leave the room. What I did was destroy all but the last wall, go back to farm health and missiles, save, and then went in for the final battle. This is the best way I could think of to make this final part even slightly bearable. Thankfully, the fight with Mother Brain itself isn't too bad, but my previous complaints with being knocked off your platform still stand. All I can say is, do your best to freeze the Cheerios before they reach you, and don't panic if you get knocked into the lava. You'll eventually take down Mother Brain and begin my favorite part of the entire game, the escape sequence. This part has become a staple of the Metroid series, and for good reason. It's a bombastic way to conclude your adventure and instantly heightens the tension as you scurry to escape the exploding facility or planet. In the case of the first game, you also have to do some pretty precise platforming as you ascend out of Torian. Once you get in a rhythm of jumps though, it's pretty easy. And with a successful escape, you finally reach the ending and get your reward of seeing Samus without her armor. This is where many people first realized she was female, and it's a cool reveal for sure. What's also cool is the incentive to beat the game faster to get different endings. But what those different endings are is kinda... Basically, you get to see Samus with less and less clothing depending on how quickly you beat the game. It's not inherently bad, however, it is a bit... exploitative? I mean, Samus isn't real, so there's no real harm in it, but it definitely feels out of place by today's standards, and I'm glad we've gotten away from it. Nowadays, you'll often get to see Samus without her helmet, or get some cool artwork that you can look at in the menu. Things that are much more motivating to me than seeing some pixelated boobas. But that's it for Metroid on the NES. A game that is both frustratingly dated and revolutionary at the same time. A game with an atmosphere so thick and vivid you can't help but admire it. A game that spawned an entire franchise and genre of video games, and gave us Samus Aran. A game that I would not blame anyone for skipping. I may enjoy it, and I may have had the patience to learn it, but not everyone is gonna want to do that. And that's okay. Now that Zero Mission is on NSO, you can easily play that instead, and I wholly think you should if you're new to the franchise. At the same time, I can't say that this game is horrible. Frustrating at times, certainly, but not bad. It reminds me a lot of a Souls game in that way, which is funny considering Hidetaka Miyazaki wanted to return to a more quote-unquote old-school style of difficulty with Dark Souls. He embraced the idea that a fair challenge, when overcome, is the best feeling in the world. Now, you could argue that Metroid is unfair, and I wouldn't disagree, but I'd also tell you the same thing that every single Souls-like veteran will tell you about their games. Get good.